Welcome back, everyone, to Inside the Agency. We have a very special topic today and a very special guest that we're exploring it with. We're talking about a number that a lot of agency owners often think about, and it's a revenue figure. And the number is 1 million in annual revenue. Some are aiming for it this year, some just reached it last year. For many, it's a goal that they're working towards every single day. But the reason we're covering it is because it's often the point where the things that used to work suddenly stop working. This episode is why agencies tend to stray, install, quietly fall apart around this stage, and more importantly, how to approach 2026 differently so you don't repeat the same cycle. Given the timing of this episode, I think it's ideal for a lot of people to have some takeaways to set this year right and set the tone for the rest of the year. So, coming to our guest, I'm joined today by the amazing Leah Leaves from Alderaan. Leah works closely with agencies at this exact stage, helping remove operational bottlenecks, giving founders breathing room and clarity, and most importantly, a way to think differently about structure, people, processes, and leverage as they scale. If you're under 1 million, aiming for it, just hit it, or recovering from pushing past it last year, this one's for you. Leah, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited because it's one of my favorite topics. It's to talk to agency founders and owners, all about how to push through, some of those growing pains.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we're going to do. And before we go into, what breaks and how to fix it and lots of things that you've seen firsthand working directly with agencies, I think let's just also frame this milestone and talk a bit about it, because a lot of founders treat it maybe as a finish line. So many people listening to us today might see it as a someday goal for their agency, where things might start to feel cleaner, simpler, easier, but oftentimes that's not really what happens. So from what you've seen, how do agency expectations change as they're approaching 1 million? And, what are some things you've seen about how founders look at this milestone?
It's definitely an incredible milestone, for a lot of agency owners to celebrate, and recognize, like, as you mentioned, it's not a finish line.
Yep.
It's not an end goal where everything just magically gets easier, or it stops, hurting at that point. It's a entirely new challenge every time you hit a new ceiling and then push through it. And there's some areas that we've found, over the years working with so many agencies, that really come to the surface, in that transition of leading up to the 1 million mark and then right after. One that I don't think that gets a lot of airtime actually is around the client experience and specifically how that translates into the founder's changing identity.
Yeah.
Because they're coming to you now because you've got a proven system. You have a team, behind you and that can produce what you're promising. So they're now starting to buy into a system, not necessarily buying into you, the agency founder or owner.
Right.
And it's a mindset shift that not a lot of owners and founders are prepared for, because all of a sudden they're no longer, the sun, that everything is revolving around, and unfortunately, they're just not prepared, for what do they do next? Where do they fit in? And especially if they have been successful in getting out of some of the operations, client, management, some of the day-to-day work, if they have been successful in building some of those processes and systems, then they haven't really set up, like, what do they do next?
Yeah.
And so that's a big one, but I will be honest that it's probably not one that most agency owners and founders, have time to consider yet,
Yeah.
because most of them have not set into the systems and the processes, and built up, the team to do the work. They may still be really the bottleneck. And so that applies to everything in the business, not just what we often expect, like client management, project management, client fires, but also the internal decisions that they have become the bottleneck for, like finance,
Yeah.
and hiring and firing, and legal and compliance, all those business operations things that they don't really think, ahead about. So there are a lot of components that are involved with it, but those are kind of the two main areas, that we see. One is, again, definitely their mindset shift and the identity shift that's going to come with natural growth, but then also to prepare for that and give them the space to think through that is, oh yeah, you've got to have your system, your processes, your ownership roles, all of those pieces, prepared ahead of time too.
Yeah. Like you said, with problems resurfacing, a lot of the things that you may have been able to ignore and get by till this stage, when they resurface after this stage, you feel them much more because now those problems have turned into a full-blown crisis a lot of times. And then again, you talked about client experience. One thing I really wanted to talk about here is that there's one thing a lot of agencies wear as a badge, and that's clients saying that we almost feel like we're your only client. We get so much time, we get so much attention from you. And agencies can do that and be proud of that when they're smaller. But as they grow, you can't allow every client to feel like they're your only client. And that's why sometimes churn happens. Clients may feel that it's not the same, when it was more early stage for you guys, things were very different. Everything was very hands-on from the founder or the senior management. Now we feel like, it's not the same, but that's a lot of times the client experience is something that comes in, and something I do want to go into when we talk about all the things that break. But talking about this milestone as well, what's the first moment you've seen or you can tell an agency is entering the danger zone, even if revenue looks fine? Some early signs, some early symptoms.
Ooh, some early symptoms. In this one, you'll hear more and more frequently, and you want to start like making a list of how many times you've heard it, is when your team is starting to say things like, I didn't know that. And it sounds so simple on the surface, but it goes layers and layers deep into your organization because what it's signaling, is that your agency has been built on tribal knowledge. It's been built on hustle culture, and, oh, let's just jump on a quick huddle and we'll resolve it together, rather than systems and infrastructure, and a foundation, that you could put anybody into, and it still runs, so little comments like that are like, well, I didn't know that, and that can erode, the trust of the team as well when they start feeling like they're out of the loop. Yeah, and it's not a matter of agency owners trying to step in with like more meetings and more status updates, and jumping onto more one-on-ones. It's building up more of that infrastructure, like a sales to service handoff, for example. Like that's a really, really key inflection point for most agencies where a lot of the tribal knowledge from sales, which in most smaller agencies is still going to be the owner, of course, like all of that relationship building knowledge that they've built up in the sales process and the funnel with that lead and then ultimately that client just falls out the bottom, when it gets moved over into contract negotiations and finance, and then ultimately into the service, team's hands. And so you can't rely on just having a quick conversation any longer. You need to be able to capture, that information. And thankfully, we have a lot of tools now, that can support that. And I will asterisk that with it's really important to encourage a process around it rather than just saying, oh, yeah, I'll just send you over the transcript, because then that's actually doubling up on the expectation, for your team to weed through it and to then try and interpret, what you learned, right? Like you're still in charge, of that knowledge and of that information, and packaging it in a way, that goes from sales to service, really smoothly. So when you start hearing like, oh, I didn't know that, then you want to start preempting it, with, oh, it's documented here, or I captured it there.
Yeah.
And this is where our one source of truth about our clients and their history lives. So that definitely is probably the key one. There are a lot of different flags, but that one we hear a lot. And when agency owners don't pay attention to it and act, upon it,
Yeah.
it just snowballs and it gets a lot, like you said earlier, like it gets a lot worse, the longer you leave things like that.
Absolutely. I think with a lot of agencies, you do see the regular intake form, which then goes over to an onboarding call, which is great. But then what about the snapshots of what their ad accounts or their SEO visibility used to look like before we started working on that on their accounts? Because 3 months down, if they come back saying, oh, we're not seeing traction or we're not seeing the results, at least you can show them the progress that this was our starting point. But if documenting that starting point and going over everything that was happening before you guys started working on that account, and then 100 other things, like you said, that get a client to that final onboarding call, which then suddenly, gets missed here and there. And a lot of times either lives in the transcripts of the calls, which, like you said, going through all of that is going to take more time for agencies. And it comes back to what you said. It's the I didn't know that, which is, maybe information gaps, big gaps within the company or the agency around information, which are either coming from not documenting, or they're coming from not having enough one-on-ones or conversations, and just huddles here and there when something does come up, which means you've not addressed the root of the problem. It's a one-time fix. I think that's a great first symptom to look for. Apart from this, okay, we've talked about the information gap, but still, when you hear we're nearly at 1 million, or we're about to reach this milestone by the next quarter, what's the first thing you'd want to check behind the scenes, or who maybe you'd want to check on behind the scenes on how they're doing?
Ooh, okay, this is such a good one because what I often will look for, and what I've trained, our operators and our project managers to look for, when they're first jumping into an agency, honestly, is how many checklists does the agency have? Yeah, and the reason why, is not for the sake of documentation for itself, or just to say like, okay, we have it, on paper here. It's to really show that the agency, is running, on a system, that is built, for success and scalability rather than built on emotions.
Okay.
A great example of this, is that we know that a lot of agency owners, don't really break because they earn too much money, right? Like they're gaining, a bunch of traction, and they're bringing in, new clients, and they're really successful, and they're hitting that 1 million mark. Like they're not breaking because they're hitting the revenue goals. They're breaking because all of that decision-making power, is still in the agency owner's head, and everybody's routing back to it. And so if the agency owner, has done their due diligence and worked with the team, and helped translate, some of their tribal knowledge, some of their strategic, decision-making skills, into the simple checklist, then your team can make the same or similar decisions, on your behalf, right? Whether it is something like handling a client, contract negotiation, or scope of work, issues, or reporting errors, internal, again, like the hiring, firing, is a great example here, where instead of going off of a gut feel of, oh, I like this person, or they feel like, they're a good, candidate, and they've got the know-how, it's, do they align with this checklist? Do they hit the marks that we've said are examples of what good looks like versus examples of what bad looks like?
Yeah.
And having that one simple tool, a very simple checklist, for every part of your business. You may, if you have the capacity, you may have, SOPs, standard operating procedures. You may have guidebooks, rule books. Like, great, that would be awesome if you had all of that. Again, most agencies don't. So what I often will encourage them to do is distill it down to its most basic format of just this gateway of a checklist.
Yeah.
Does it hit the checklist? Yes or no? If it doesn't pass go. Great. You have that information super, super quick, and your team can start making faster decisions that still align with your core values, with your brand, with your strategic vision, without you, the owner, having to be in every single one of those conversations or decisions yourself. So yeah, we often look for, like, again, it sounds so simple, but it's so, so powerful. If you have checklists, and you just keep building those out, as the gateways for decision making and quality control and quality assurance, like, you are light years ahead, of a lot of agencies.
Yeah, absolutely. I think checklists, like you said, they are really simple, but I think the value is underrated, because if you have a checklist for something, it's hard to drop the ball. And even for when you drop the ball, I think, again, there should be a checklist. What needs to be done in a crisis? What needs to be done when we've made a mistake? So whether it's a campaign that needs to go out, an SEO audit, it just helps you make sure that you're going through the steps. And it allows you to hand over so that if anyone goes through these steps, they'll get the desired outcome, which means, senior managers and agency owners, they can take a step back and work on more strategic and higher value tasks, which move the needle for the agency. But absolutely, checklists, again, in what I do as well, which revolves a lot around people and hiring, an onboarding checklist and offboarding checklist, making sure they have the employee handbook, making sure we have their employee form, for instance, which covers things like how they like to receive feedback. Oftentimes, agency owners are not HR specialists or recruiters, but if they just ask simple questions like, do you like feedbacks on group calls? Do you like it one-on-one? Do you like it via text? How do you prefer, do you like a collaborative document? Questions like these allow you to understand each team member better. But yeah, checklists, I think there's something they're really underrated, and it's something I use all the time in what I do. So that's a great piece of advice as well.
One other thing I really want to be quick here in mentioning as well, that another reason I really like checklists rather than agency owners jumping straight into like SOPs, because they expect that like they have to have the whole playbook documented from A to Z,
Yeah.
And oftentimes that's a big ask, for most agency owners,
Yeah.
to sit down and write exactly how they do everything, from the start, of the business and sales and marketing, through HR, admin, finance, like all the way through delivery and service and client experience. So it's a huge, huge ask to do that, and I'll be honest, like this is one of the reasons, why, you hired your team, is because they are the expert in their specific, field. They are the expert, in their specific role. And so sometimes it actually helps break down, some of that tension, between owners, and their team when you're just giving the checklist of what done looks like, what good looks like to your team, and then they figure out the how to get there.
Yeah.
Right. Because not everybody is going to have a perfectly documented SOP with, exact instruction. Plus, like things are changing so rapidly, especially with AI over the last few years.
Yeah.
You have to adapt and be flexible. And so let the team be flexible, just give them the outcome that you're looking for, give them the definition of done in a checklist, and then it gives them the space and the breathing room to be creative to get to that. And then you can also, and I know you know this in particular from, hiring and team management, then the conversation around their performance is so much more clear to have, because then you can say, here was the definition of done, here's what was, told to be included or excluded, and you didn't hit it.
Yeah.
Let's talk it through. Or you did hit it. Congratulations. Like you are a rock star. Like let's keep moving. Like maybe you can create some of these checklists for your peers as well.
Yeah.
So that's one of the reasons why I think a checklist is like, again, so powerful in so many ways but I could talk about checklists all day. So we should probably move on.
Absolutely. I think that's its own episode, because again, there's so much I would also want to cover here. Even with the hiring part, like you said, oftentimes agency owners, when they're hiring, they don't define what success would look like for that hire. And then that's actually unfair to them as well, because they're not the new hire. They don't know exactly what they're supposed to achieve or what success would look like for them. But if they again had a 30-day, 90-day roadmap or checklist for what are the things, if this person is able to achieve in these first 30, 60, 90 days, then I would say this hire was successful. And if they don't, then we need to sit down and revisit why we hired for this particular role. So again, a checklist for everything, I think that's great advice. So with that, I think let's also talk about some other things that do start to break, or where agency owners can start to see the pain, or see things not going or working according to what they thought it would be at this stage. So when agencies look successful on the outside, hitting these revenue marks or hitting these milestones in terms of finance or team members, where does the pressure usually show up first in what you've seen?
So I would say the pressure really shows up, in the agency owner hesitating to hire what they consider is overhead.
Yeah.
Because the larger you're growing, the more complex, the operations, may become. And it's a natural part of the growth, cycle, that you can keep your systems and you can keep your product offerings or your service offerings, as simple as possible. You can productize them as much as you can, and we're still dealing with humans and the interactions, with AI, and the combination, of this bionic, organizational chart, going into 2026, and so what I'm still seeing, are agency owners hesitating, to actually put in the systems experts. They may continue to bring in some relief for like capacity with like junior level talent, and fill in the execution gaps because they're just like, oh, I just got to get this work out the door, but I'll be honest, going into 2026, human speed just cannot match the speed of AI,
Yeah.
right? We can't outwork, AI. We can't out hustle it, and it's really important that most agency owners, start leveling up out of just execution and deliverables and into more strategic value, that they're offering.
Yeah.
And that requires systems, that requires more strategic thinking. And so it really comes down to a couple of key roles that I think a lot of agency owners hesitate the most with. One is the overhead, like I mentioned, like an operator, apps manager, project managers, account managers, being client facing, really the people at the front of the lines, and the back, of the house, to make sure that the system is running smoothly. But the other one are senior level strategists. Again, because most agency owners will just fill in, the bottom of the funnel. They'll fill in, the bottom of the organizational chart typically, because they're not always as comfortable knowing their numbers. So they don't know what their margin really looks like. So they may be hitting their growth goals at the top of that profit and loss statement of revenue, but they don't know the middle of gross profit margin, and they sometimes don't even know their net profit margin. And so when they don't know their own numbers, then they're even more uncomfortable to say, oh, I can hire more overhead, or I can hire, a more strategic, level individual, that could replace maybe 3 to 5, junior level team members,
Yeah.
with the support still, of other managers, or, other AI. So I think in 2026, we've got to really kind of shake up that motion, of the agency owner still hesitating,
Yeah.
to bring in, individuals that are more at a leadership level, a strategic level, whether it's again on the operations side, or strategic, value for the clients, rather than just trying to fill in those micro gaps, at the bottom.
Yeah, I think I would see this as, hiring someone who would complete tasks versus hiring someone who moves the needle for the agency. And again, tasks are something we see every day and we want to get them out of the way. But like you said, these bigger gaps might not be immediately visible, but that's where the agencies are usually lacking. So, and again, with these senior hires, you obviously get what you pay for. So that means having a bigger budget for these hires, but that again refeeds the agency, and you make that back tenfold if you're investing in such a hire, because they then come with the processes and the strategies that are built for the agency to scale. And like we discussed earlier, the things that got you to this stage might not be the things that get you, beyond and further and allow you to stay there. So yeah, and I think another place I've seen pressure initially show up, which is something we also discussed briefly already, which is clients. They're the first ones to feel it. Either timeline slip or communication gaps start to appear, but clients, I think, are the first ones to feel or understand that something's probably up here. It's not going the way it used to. So I think if you had to name the first system that usually collapses at this stage, would you say it's hiring? Is it delivery? Is it onboarding? Is it offboarding? Is it what kind, is it decision making? What are some of the systems that you see initially that also start to collapse as the agency is feeling these different symptoms?
Great question. Because I I would argue that any time that there is a handoff involved, that is a potential weak point, and I will often come back to the example of like sales to service, and that particular handoff is incredibly vital, to this again sustainability and success, of the business. Because if you can get that right, you can almost always, then have the buffer to figure out more systems, and improve, others. So for example, Like team onboarding, I'm a huge proponent, of having intentional team onboarding. And I will argue, that it could potentially come secondary, to something like sales to service, because, for most agencies, they need to have a healthy lead gen pipeline. They need to have a healthy sales process. And then they need to have that pivotal moment, of sales to service be successful, because I still see a lot of agencies, that deal with really high client churn. And it's because they were sold something and a specific expectation, that they're not receiving, from the service, and so you can handle, internal, team onboarding and team offboarding. You can handle money management, like money in, money out, all those different things. You can handle those for the foreseeable future. You still need systems, built out, but you can handle them kind of behind the scenes, where the clients, like you were saying, aren't, as impacted, but the one that the clients feel, that is going to stick with them for the lifetime, of their account with you is that handoff.
Yeah.
And if an owner doesn't take the time with their team, like this is not a solo endeavor, they don't have to do it all on their own. The weight isn't all on their shoulders,
Yeah.
but if they don't take that time with their team to craft what that experience looks like, so that you have information about, okay, what were those expectations that were sold, but then also what are those little nuances, that still make us human,
Yeah.
right? So for example, we had an agency owner we worked with, whose daughter was going into the hospital like the week after we were doing a kickoff, and it was that little moment, of capturing that note, handing it off, to the service team, and of course sent a card and flowers, and then followed up, every week for the next, month to see, how the family was doing, and that was so impactful, to that relationship, because they don't remember, how they got in the door at the beginning, typically. They remember how you made them feel,
Absolutely.
and if you're showing up, and really working hard for them and really showing them the value, of the relationship that you've built with them, it pays off in spades, because then not only do you have, hopefully a lifetime, customer in some way, shape, or form, but then also you have a raving fan. You have, more opportunities for testimonials. You have also an incredible opportunity to ask for candid feedback. Not a lot of agencies, have this built into their systems. They might do, some things like NPS, Net Promoter Score, or CSAT, like Client Satisfaction Score, and they leave it at the number, right? But they don't necessarily go back and ask questions, and then check, like, okay, you gave us a 9 out of 10. What does that really mean? And where did we show up that, like, you're so excited about working with us?
Yeah.
Or, ooh, you gave us a 6 out of 10. Okay, I would love to hear, like, how could we have improved that experience for you? Not just like, oh, what are we going to do going, forward? But like, no, I'd actually like to do that reflection, and give it to me straight, and so building up that relationship, with your clients, is so important. So I think that sales to service handoff is a really good example of it. I'd say if you map out your client journey, through the business, again, I typically think in very linear fashion from left to right on the organizational chart. You've got your growth of marketing and sales, how they come in the door, and come through. Then you've got all of your operations and finance, and like, what does the team look like that's working on the account? And then you've got the actual, what a lot of people put into client experience of like client success and service and delivery. And so if you map out just a simple, step by step, like, how does a client go through that journey with you? And you put a little node into each handoff. So how many times is information, being handed off internally? And where could it be smoothed out? Where could it be improved? Where could we gain more data points, along the way from the client that reinforces the experience, for them? And so I think that's definitely an area that I emphasize quite heavily, because if you can get that to 80%, like, and I'm a huge proponent of like the 80-20 rule, but if you can get it to like 80%, you've got the top 20% that makes it the most impactful, and 80% of it, documented and successful, then you still have that wiggle room, to improve and iterate and grow along the way, and the buffer internally to then go in to your internal systems, and continue to improve them. So it's almost always we'll say, hey, handle the client facing stuff first, have a project manager, that owns that client relationship, and then bring in, that operator internally to build in more of those structural systems to keep everything else, running smoothly as well, because then you can focus on the team experience and what culture looks like, and where are we growing and what does the vision look like, rather than just externally facing, metrics. So it's just a long example of it, but it's one that I'll come back to time and again.
What you said about the client experience and how you make people feel, and then you tied it back to your team as well and your culture and how you've made your team members feel as well. Because again, not being a people first company or a people first agency in today's time, I think it's not an option. Every agency has to be one that's looking after its people and trying to establish a culture. I've one saying about culture that whether you are intentional about it or not, every organization does have a culture. So why not build one that you're actually proud of, and why not be intentional about it to create something that your team members actually mention about their time spent there, that the culture was amazing. And that obviously comes back to a lot of things, but the number one thing it comes back to is how you make people feel, because that's something they always remember. So I think that was a great example, which goes from clients to team members and allows you, and I think it's actually possible in today's time to be both client first and people first. It doesn't mean just because you put client first that your team members or employees come second. You can actually do both, and especially with the right clients, you can. And if certain clients don't allow you to do that or can be a bit difficult, I think again, at this stage, you actually have the option to choose who you're working with, because it's a great position to be in, which is another positive thing about this 1 million mark, that you can actually choose who you're working with and align yourself to clients who your team members also enjoy working with, and allows you to have a culture in your agency that you're proud of. So I think coming to people, that's the next thing I also wanted to talk about, which is people, hiring, culture, founder load. So uh, how does hiring, and hesitation around hiring show up operationally at this stage? Because what I've seen is that small agencies are able to get to this revenue mark. And when I say small, I mean between 8 to 15 staff are a lot of times able to reach this revenue stage. But it comes at a cost, because that's a small team bringing in a lot of revenue, which means a lot of people are strained, a lot of people are overburdened, and the team is more likely than not, stressed about the stuff that they're doing. So, and that also comes from hesitation around hiring, because hiring is so expensive. Agency owners most times try to run a small team. So this hesitation around hiring, the main question would be, what's the cost of it? Being hesitant around hiring, not building the right team, not growing your team at the right time, and what does it cost over time?
It costs you peace of mind, first of all. It costs you time with your family, with your friends, like your personal life is really what it costs you, the owner. Because when we see, the owners typically hesitating to elevate into some of those higher levels, of roles, that it really impacts them. It impacts them first and foremost, and then it starts to bleed out into, it starts impacting like their reputation, as well, because if they're not able, to come, with a strong, confident, mindset, and a calm perspective, then it's going to start impacting the team that they do have, which breaks down quality control. It impacts the client experience, and it can really snowball. So that's the big picture, that we're looking at, with hiring. And we see that there's a lot of opportunity today to be flexible in the hiring approach, because there are more opportunities than ever before, for agency owners, to find the right people for the right seats. That doesn't look like the traditional agency, I would say even 10 years ago. Full-time employees, they all had to be located in the same, area. And I know that these aren't necessarily new concepts, for 2026 going into what we're looking at with fractional hires, or contract hires. When you're looking at temp to hire, for example, or temp to full time, when you're looking at geo arbitrage and outsourcing, to different locations, as well. Remote, agencies, are much more common, than they ever have been. So there's a lot of flexibility with it. And I think going to, point you had made as well of like really being intentional, about, the hiring, it's about taking that time to ensure that, from an agency owner perspective, that you have your core values identified, documented, and shared, publicly, because that really is the driving force, for hiring.
Yeah.
That is the driving force for finding the right, people. And don't get me wrong, you're not going to hit a 10 out of 10 every single time. It's not going to be perfect, every single time. But, the drawback, of making a wrong hire, a too quick hire, because you're just in a lot of pain and you just want to get somebody in,
Yeah.
It could dramatically alter the course of your agency if you're not careful because of what the impact it will have on the other team members.
Yeah.
Right. Because then all of a sudden, if you've made a bad hire, where it impacts the morale of the team, they start to lose trust in you. So
Yeah.
they may gripe, and complain about the person that they're virtually sitting next to, but really, they're holding you responsible. They're blaming you, and this also goes back to, why it's really important to have systems in place and checklists, in place, for things like hiring, to
Yeah.
know that you're not doing it, just off of your gut. Like you're actually looking for specific skills, specific experience. You're looking for specific strategic thinking, and problem solving ability. And so it's really important to spend the time, on the hiring system,
Yeah.
And if you can, if you have the capacity, to work with, an external, consultant or a recruiter or someone else, especially for some of those next level hires that you're looking for, because and it's okay. Like not every agency owner, has been in an agency of this size before. It may be their first time that they are leading the charge, and growing a business like this, and so they may not know, what new skill sets to be looking for because they're so used to kind of the old skill sets.
Yeah.
So they may be used to like, oh, I can spot a marketing specialist from a mile away, and I know what to look for, when I'm looking for, an SEO copywriter, but they may not be as comfortable saying, I know what I'm looking for, in a people manager,
Yeah.
or I know what I'm looking for, in a digital strategist, so I definitely recommend, if they can, again, work with somebody, external to bring in that knowledge, right? Like hire the expert, if they may not have the budget, then go to a community, right? There's so many incredible agency specific communities, that are virtual that they can jump into, and gain some knowledge from coaches and people that have been there, done that before, other agency owners. Like there's so many areas to go to, but definitely take your time, with hire. Like, and I think many people have heard this, and if they haven't, I'm excited to share it with them. It's always important to hire slow and fire fast.
Yeah.
So take that time, know what you're looking for, set the expectations, set the person up for success with the right checklist, ahead of time. Make sure that you're doing your due diligence as best you can.
Yep.
We're not perfect and we're not looking for perfect. We're just looking for, the best you can, and then, when something is not working, when they're not hitting the checklist, when you do see team morale, is dropping, and it's more about a toxic behavior that you're seeing from a potential hire,
Yeah.
then fire fast. Like protect the integrity, of what you've built, so that you can continue to grow and iterate on it over time. So I know I went a little broad there, but I hope that, helped answer, the perspective on hiring.
Absolutely, it did. And I think the hire slow, fire fast, I think that's a really good piece of advice because again, you can't really judge. You can do your due diligence and like we discussed, there's a checklist. So if you go through the checklist, if everything's great, yes, you go with the hire. But again, you only know how well a person is going to perform at your agency once they join. And if you see that it's not going the way it should be, then um, it's important to take that decision quickly rather than let that sit, because that's going to cost you momentum. So I think that's a great advice as well. Uh, with my conversation with agency coaches, and especially with Chris Dubois, he helped me coin the term recruitment debt, which when we're talking about slowing down or the cost of slowing down, he said just like debt, it stacks up. And the hire you didn't go with at the right time, it's going to lead to lost clients, and then you're going to panic, and then you're going to give money to a recruiter, and that's going to add more to your debt. And then you're going to hire someone hastily, and that might not be the ideal hire. So what he explained was that, and then again, the time you've lost during this time, the cost of training someone new, the cost of replacing them because you rushed the decision, it stacks up and it snowballs. So I think with the delay part, that's oftentimes what it's not visible, because it's not financial debt that's immediately visible to you. So oftentimes agency owners don't see it, but it does stack up, and then it can manifest in a lot of different places. So the cost of waiting is real. So
And that's a great point to bring up. And I love Chris's work, as well, because what we typically see is when you're in a smaller agency, there are a lot of agency individuals, individual contributors, managers, the agency owner themselves, that can fix things very, very quickly.
yeah,
And they could just like jump in, like, oh, that team member didn't work out, so I'm just going to take on that load, really quickly, and we'll try and do a recruiting sprint in the background, and fill in that gap. And so their speed is solving, these quick fix problems, that does not scale, because the larger you grow, that speed then starts to create those problems. You are making the tough decision, to fire somebody, and you're waiting and you're waiting and you're waiting because you're like, oh, I just can't, handle this workload, on my own, then it can creep in, and hurt, the team even deeper, and so you've got to make that quick decision, and then you need to have your system in place, to make sure recruiting, is finding the next right fit.
yeah,
You need to have that checklist, for what, the next right person looks like. So when you're getting larger, that the quick fix mentality just does not scale.
yeah, absolutely. So I think just one more thing around the people section is that I'd like to ask is, what's one hire? And I know a lot of agencies are different, and their services are different, their models are different, but across the agencies you've seen and worked with, what's one hire that you've seen instantly move the needle, make life easier for agency owners and their senior management, a crucial hire that absolutely every agency needs?
I actually have two. Uh, the first one, and this is because I think in kind of the front of the house and the back of the house. And so the front of the house, you need to have a strong digital project manager that gets the owner out of client-facing conversations.
Got it.
And I'm talking like 100% of the client conversation, because one issue that we see with agency owners, say they do hire, a project manager, and a client issue comes up, they want to do something that's out of scope and they don't want to pay for it. They just expect it to be, inherent, to the relationship, and the project manager is trying to push back and it's not working, and it starts to escalate, and so what will typically happen is the project manager brings it back to the owner. What do I do in this situation? This is what I've tried. The owner says, oh, this is what you should do. And then the owner jumps in and responds for them. So
Yeah,
what you can do is give that input, give that feedback, give the suggestions, coach up that project manager, but then the project manager responds still.
yeah,
So they own the input and the output, of that conversation, with the client. So that's a crucial hire, is just getting the agency owner out of client-facing engagements. That's so incredibly supportive, of long-term growth.
yeah,
And then the second one, is that operator. So whether it's an ops director, it's an integrator, it's an ops lead, head of ops, like there are all kinds of terms and titles and roles that you might hear, but this is not a virtual assistant. This is not a task-based role. This is a systems architect. This is someone who comes in and they start becoming the buffer, between the owner and the team. So just like the project manager is the buffer, between the owner and the clients, now you've got the internal buffer, as well. So the operator, is really there to take the brain dumps, of the owner, translate them into here's what good looks like. These are our systems of judgment and decision-making rules, and then enforcing them.
Yeah.
Right. So, and this is another great example, of where the agency owner, it's one of the hardest things to do, is to step back and let them do their job, right? The operator. But say that a team member isn't performing well, and the operator is having performance review with them, and they come to the owner and they say, hey, I think we need to get rid of this person. We need to replace them. It's imperative that the owner does not override that, jump back in, come in and say, oh no, this person has been with me for like 10 years. We can't lose them. It's like, they're not performing, and they're not leveling up as the agency grows. Like, it's important to be honest with ourselves. And so you have to step back and let the operator enforce the rules that you told them you wanted, to be enforced. So I'd say those two roles are the most important for agencies to truly be able to grow and grow sustainably, grow
Yeah.
without that chaos, so both with client fires and then internal decision fatigue. I'd say get yourself a project manager and get yourself an operator, and then you can really build something that can run without you.
Yeah, I think those are definitely two of the most crucial roles that I've also heard from most conversations with coaches as well as other agency owners. They do, you can see these roles in different titles and different forms. Again, the project manager might be your account manager or someone who's basically a client manager. But they're mainly getting you out of those weekly check-ins and those client calls because that is time taking. And getting out of those allows the owner to create some leverage. And then, like you said, someone who's managing internal operations, because if the agency owner is still reviewing each employee and then doing performance feedbacks and then looking at every single aspect of letting people go or bringing in new people and all of these decisions, then that's also it's 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 just as bad as being involved in the delivery and the client facing, because then again you'll just be stuck, because this is also an entire field. It's an entire discipline that an agency owner often finds themselves in alongside working on projects and being on the tools and doing everything. So I think those are really important roles, and I would completely agree. So I think coming to our main section, which is finding some solutions, finding some answers. How are agency owners, according to you, creating leverage today? And what I'd like to ask here is, when you're seeing founders experiment, because you talked about so many different hiring models, so many different solutions, agencies aren't looking the same. If you look at the last decade, what are you seeing founders experiment with to create leverage today?
Great question. So I'm seeing them take two things at the same time. One is, outsourcing, some of those key roles. And that means instead of hiring a full-time employee, they are bringing in like a contractor, or, a fractional, and so they're bringing somebody in who, again, is more of the expert already, that has, those skills and that experience, and then they're pairing them with more AI support. And so there's still a lot of room to grow for most agencies in their AI strategy, and what that looks like. But I still see a vast amount of them, that have really unlocked, some of the kind of AI basics. Let's say taking, for example, a client, meeting transcript, and having a custom prompt, that is listening for certain churn indicators, it's listening, for certain upsell opportunities, and that it can distill that into just a few bullet points for somebody like, the project manager, to then take and make decisions with and build off of. So they're seeing the opportunities with a lot of those um, initial, kind of layers, of AI to then support the fractional or the contract, work, to then elevate it to a new level. Because then when they have people that know fundamentally what they're doing, what the expectations are, and they have a checklist, and then they have some of these tools, that they can iterate, on as well. It gives the owner more space and capacity to really build out that strategic value, and then potentially to bring in, another strategist, to help level them up out of that role too. So we're definitely seeing kind of this, as I mentioned earlier, like the bionic, org chart. So it's a much more flexible approach, rather than the expectation of like, oh, I have to fill 40 hours a week, full-time employee with benefits, and overhead, in many other ways. Like they can be much more adaptable, to the situations, and have individuals that are coming in for 10, 20 hours a week, and are more outcomes based than they are hours based. So pairing that fractional or that contract worker, that you're still treating as a full team member, you still incorporate them into the culture, but then giving them some of the capacity, in their day-to-day, work to own the outcomes and use and leverage the tools like AI in particular and automations, to just do their work better,
Yeah.
because we know that AI in particular amplifies the work that you do. So if you are running chaotically through the day to day, if you are making snap decisions, and you don't have systems that you're building off of, AI is just going to amplify that.
Yeah.
And so you have systems in place, checklists, and you have the right people in the right seats, to then employ those, tools, you can elevate, and really grow the business more holistically.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you're at this exact stage, that's where you can start to experiment with a lot of these different things and different hiring models, because um, hiring today, it's very different, and there's so many different models, there's so many different options like you've mentioned, and these models are more outcomes based rather than just filling in the hours. And again, just because these aren't full-time team members, I'd completely agree that they should still be incorporated within the agency, because if they aren't on those client calls and if they aren't part of decision making, then again, they'd just be someone who's doing tasks without context. And that in return ends up with team members who aren't moving the agency forward, who are just completing tasks. And today, from the clients I've worked with and from the people I'm working with, they're looking for more and more people who want to take the agency forward rather than just be a paid media specialist or just be an SEO executive or just be an AI optimization expert. They want someone who understands all of that in the larger context of the agency, and then does what they do, but also moves the needle forward, finds opportunities for strategic positioning within that service. What can we do that other agencies are not doing right now within my position, rather than just saying, okay, I've done my audits, I've written the articles, or I've launched the campaign. And that's what agency owners are looking for right now, with people who have skin in the game and who are just as much involved with the agency owner in trying to take the agency forward rather than just fill in the hours. So I think that's also another part where you involve your team members, because to achieve that, you have to make sure that they are stakeholders, not just team members, and you involve them in decision making. You tell them why you're working with a particular client, why you are offering this particular service, what you're expecting from the service, and the outcomes that you're expecting. So I think that's a big part of it as well. Just one more question on the hiring front before we go on to our last section. What work do you believe should never sit with the founder at this stage? And before we go into the answer, I do understand that, again, stepping back for agency owners, that's also become a very big message that's being screamed a lot right now for all agency owners. But at the same time, I believe the agency owner, if they enjoy doing something, or if they're really good at something, they don't really need to step back from it. But it's more about prioritizing what they should be working on, right? So at this stage, and talking about, depending on what agency owners actually like to do they really like designing websites? Are they a big geek when it comes to code and they really like developing web solutions? What should still then not be on their plate at this stage?
So this is fun because we've definitely worked with agency owners, who have pushed back, like you're commenting, on that agency owner should be out of everything, because they got into this business typically because they enjoyed what they started with, right? Marketing strategy, or design and development, and so some agency owners, that do want to stay, connected to that, we see building out a like chief strategy officer role for them so that they have still roles and responsibilities. They know what hat they're putting on at certain times. Am I in the owner seat? Am I in the CEO seat? Am I in the chief strategy officer seat? So then it's also really clear to the company and to the team, as well. And I would argue that there are some baselines, of what they still should not be doing. And one of those, a very simple one, is bookkeeping. Money, is one of the last items, for them to delegate. And of course, my assumption, and knowledge, with several agency owners we've worked with, comes from this being really fear-based, that they are uncomfortable, with sharing the numbers. They are not sure that somebody else can do it the right way, or that they have, certain ways, of allocating funds, that they just haven't systematized, or codified. So bookkeeping still becomes one of those last items that is on their plates that should not be on their plate, right? Like, and some of this is because they're not bookkeepers, they're not, finance professionals. The finance professional's perspective of like, are you actually on an accrual basis rather than cash basis in your accounting? Most agency owners start looking at me blankly when I start talking like that, because there's like, I have no idea, I don't know what that means. Right. And that's okay that you don't know what that means at the stage. You don't need to be the one that owns that. So something like that, like bookkeeping, is a really prime example of get that off of your plate earlier, rather than later, because it's just going to hang like a noose around your neck, the longer that you let it go. And this goes for a lot of like finance related items, but bookkeeping, accounting, and tax related items, definitely one of the first, areas. I'd say, another one, this goes into some of the execution work, is more quality assurance and quality control. And it's things that they hold on to, because they haven't articulated their code of conduct, for what quality looks like, what done looks like. So this goes back to the point about the checklist, right? Is that once they can get some of that knowledge out of their head and onto paper and build out a checklist of what a QA checklist looks like, what a QC checklist looks like, then they should really be getting out of that minute checklist level, work, because it is going to suck their soul, out, for how much time, it's just not valuable, for them to be doing. And then the last area that I would say that we still see a lot of owners, struggle with, is getting out of their email inbox and their calendar management. Right. So if we're looking at like some of the internal ops, being finance, and then you've got your delivery work still being QA and QC, then one other big area is, being the owner, an operator of a company, being in sales, being in marketing, being in hiring and firing and all these pieces. There's a lot that comes through your inbox for your attention, and if you are having to make those micro decisions 100 times throughout the day of how do I respond to this? Where do I fit this in? When does it make sense for me to chat with this next person? The decision fatigue hits dramatically for agency owners that are starting to crest into that 1 million mark, because they have just a compounded level of decisions they have to make. So if you can get out of that executive admin seat yourself, it is game changing.
Absolutely. I think the finance option, the finance role that you've talked about, that's really great because, like you said before, just hire the expert or go to the expert. We have accountants for a reason, and then we have recruiters for a reason. So those are definitely things that agency owners at the point where they are, they can afford going to the expert and going to the specialist. And just like the agency owner themselves, they're a specialist at something, whether it was running ads or paid media campaigns or SEO. Similarly, there's legal experts, there's finance experts, there's operation experts, and that's who agency owners should be going to at this particular stage. if they want to keep that momentum going and if they want to go past this phase as well. Um, I think on our last section, just a few solutions or maybe a bit more value for our listeners to go away with. Before founders chase growth or try to do 1 million this year or cross it or go beyond it, what's one thing that needs to be stabilized first? And if you could also add one priority here, maybe even a checklist, I think that would be a great solution we can give to our listeners today.
Yeah, so especially as they're aiming toward that 1 million mark, I highly recommend going through a three-step checklist, a very, very simple. First and foremost, have your goals clarified. What does it actually mean, to get to 1 million, and what do I want that to look like? So for my own, life as the agency owner, for my team, for clients, what does that feel like? What do our numbers look like? So what profit, are we making? What am I reinvesting back into the company? So having just a little bit of that vision documented will dramatically support, the growth of the agency, because it gets everybody on the same page, rowing in the same direction, having like that North Star, to really go toward, and it's not written in stone, it has the flexibility, that it can, iterate and evolve over time, but just having a sense, of the direction, can really start to bring more of that traction, to the business in the right direction. So having your goals, outlined, then having your systems identified. So this goes back to outlining the client journey, right, from left to right on your organizational chart and identifying where those biggest handoff points are, because those are the systems you should focus on first. If you don't have those documented, if you don't have a checklist, for every one of those, that's your Q1 goal. And I'm talking about like a checklist that could be 7 to 10 bullet points. It doesn't have to be this really extensive, playbook that you're having to document every little detail. Just find a starting point. So start building out your systems, and not processes or procedures, or all the in the weeds work. It can be big picture. What do these systems look like? Where are these handoff points? And then now you have the architecture of your agency documented very quickly. And then the third item on this checklist is your team. So you want to look at that organizational chart. You've got the client journey mapped out on top of it. Now start looking at the roles, that you have identified and the seats that you do need to fill. Do you need that project manager? Do you need that operator? Do you need that strategist? Do you need that bookkeeper? And highlight those on your org chart in blazing yellow, and say like, that's my next priority. That's my Q2 goal, is hiring for that role. And if you just go through, what are my goals? What systems do I have, and who do I have and or need on my team? That infrastructure can help you take all this head trash that you might have, around, I've got so many new things and all these AI things that I want to try, and I need to prioritize my service. Like, yes to all of those things, but not today. It'll be just get your goals, documented, get your systems outlined, and get your team identified, get those 3 points, in Q1, and you'll be set up for success in 2026.
That's amazing. That's actually some actionable advice that people can start implementing today and planning for this year, which brings me, and I know we're going over our time, which means it's the perfect time for two rapid fire questions. And you can, again, it doesn't have to be a one word or one line answer. You can definitely elaborate, but quick burst solutions people can, quickly implement this year, this quarter, this month. So what's one decision that makes the rest of the year easier?
What is one thing you're going to stop doing as the agency owner?
Got it. And which brings me, and this is literally in writing, what's one thing agency owners need to stop doing for 2020?
Oh, that's perfect. So the one thing that I think agency owners need to stop doing is being the hero. They need to stop jumping into every fire, putting it out themselves, and It's actually one of the core values that my husband and I have, for our family is regulate, then respond. So before you jump in, take a deep breath, whew,
Yeah.
understand, what is going on, what's happening for you, and then you can respond more intentionally. And so at that point, you can say, how could somebody else solve this?
Yeah.
Or what do I need to respond with that isn't me giving them the answer? So you can be more thoughtful in your approach. So stop being the hero, regulate, and then respond.
Yeah. Amazing. I think if I could add the one thing I would say agency owners need to stop for 2026 is every time, maybe say less of I'll do it myself, or I'll continue to do it, or um, I'll just keep doing it till we get that next client, till we get that next retainer, till we get that next contract. Because a lot of times before that next client or next retainer comes, things fall apart to the point that your current clients leave, and then you have an exit before you reach that point, or right when you thought, oh, I might do it next month. That next month usually is more firefighting, more trouble, more issues, more things to do. All those things keep going to the back burner, whether that was starting a personal brand, doing more online events, hiring, all of those things that you thought you need to do, you need to start doing now, which means saying less of I'll do it myself to the things you're doing at the moment. So that would be my answer to that. And I think with that quick fire, we are at the end of our episode, and I've gone through most of my questions here. So, Leah, this was incredibly valuable. Thank you for sharing your perspective and experience. For everyone listening, if this episode resonated, take a moment to reflect on where you are right now and where you want to be. And I know we've talked a lot about this number and the 1 million in revenue, but not just the number you're chasing or the number you want to hit this year, but again, what you want your agency to be like and what you enjoy doing, because at the end, it's what you're trying to build, and it should be something you enjoy and something you actually resonate with. So if you found this valuable, share it with another agency owner who is in the thick of it. And as always, if you want more conversations like this, make sure you're following Inside the Agency. I'm going to drop some links where you can get in touch with Leah, see how to work with her, maybe get on a call if you have any questions from the things we've talked about, or if you're in this exact stage and maybe want to bounce some ideas, you can get in touch with her. But also, Leah, the floor is open for you if you'd like to just share how people can get in touch with you and maybe how you can help them.
Yeah, I really appreciate this time today because it's, as I mentioned at the very beginning, it's a conversation I have time and again and love talking about because I can see the transformation that it makes, in agency owners' lives, in the lives of their team and their clients, when they really start using, systems and start thinking, more in a process-oriented manner and that they're not in it alone. That they have support, so you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm on there all the time. I have an email newsletter that I would highly recommend subscribing to for some tips and tricks, on how to implement some of these things, quickly. And we offer fractional project managers and operations leads for remote digital marketing and ad agencies specifically. So if you are in the market and need that, I'd love to jump on a call, see if we're the right fit. And if we're not, I know all the right people, to connect you to and make sure you get the right help that you're looking for.
Amazing. Thanks for joining, Leah, and everyone who's listening. See you on the next one. Take care.